Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of Memory in a Time of Pandemic. In this series of videos, we talk with the world's leading memory experts about the ways in which the COVID pandemic is shaping our individual and collective remembering and forgetting. What will they personally remember from this time? What insights from their work and their fields will help us to understand memory both during the pandemic and of the pandemic? Will COVID change the ways in which we study memory? This series is sponsored by Memory, Mind and Media, a new interdisciplinary journal just launched by Cambridge University Press. I'm Amanda Barnier from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, founding co-editor of the journal alongside my colleague and friend, Andrew Hoskins from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Associate Professor and Scientia Education Fellow, Emma Robertson from the University of New South Wales, also here in Sydney. Emma is our artist in residence and an associate editor of Memory, Mind and Media. And you can see some of Emma's art and imagery in my Zoom background today, as well as behind Emma. Emma is an award-winning artist. She's exhibited in 8 countries and her work is in 7 public collections in 4 countries. Emma is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in London and a previous artist in residence at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. Her artwork focuses on using drawn images of endangered plant species to enhance engagement with ecology and the environment through a meditative reflection on beauty, loss, and memory. Today, I'll be talking to Emma about her art, imagery, design, and scholarship about memory, the memorable imagery and the role of art in our COVID times, and finally, Emma's plans as artist in residence and associate editor of Memory, Mind and Media. A lot to discuss. Welcome, Emma.
Oh, thank you very much, Amanda. It's lovely to be here.
Let me turn now to ask you a bit about COVID. So we've been having these conversations with various people. You referred to the other videos, and in those interviews, we've been talking about memory in a time of pandemic. Including I asked people about what are the memorable images of this time. So what are some of the, especially as an artist, what are some of the images, Emma, that have stood out to you over the last couple of years and why?
So there were 2 in particular, and they're very, very clear in my mind, and they're both very, very visual. And it comes back to this idea of the individual's experience in parallel with a collective experience. And the first thing that struck me was I started to notice that there were many more photographic essays coming out in the media. I subscribe to The Guardian, and I particularly follow the BBC and other international publications. And so these photographic essays were obviously often looking for hope in what was a pretty hopeless situation in the middle of the pandemic. So the first image that struck me were photographs of children's paintings of rainbows that they were pinning up in their doorways and windows. And then what was happening was you would actually get a whole street full of them. And then you would get a whole neighborhood full of them. So it sort of became self-perpetuating. You would see that a child stuck at home, not able to go to school, had drawn a rainbow for these incredible health workers in the front line of the National Health Service. So the rainbow became this symbol, but more than that, it actually became this collective thing. So that children everywhere were making rainbows, outside of the UK as well. The second image that really struck me, and for a very particular reason, was the COVID Memorial wall outside St Thomas's Hospital. It's actually near Westminster, near the Houses of Parliament in London. And the reason that it struck me is that I feel that the numbers that we were seeing at a certain point in the pandemic of deaths became almost incomprehensible. They were so large. And it was when I actually saw the COVID Memorial wall, which is thousands, then tens of thousands into hundreds of thousands of hearts, red hearts, where people were going to the wall, painting their heart, and then writing the name or perhaps the date of death of someone who had become close to them. So a number or just a written text for that kind of thing was almost incomprehensible. But when you walk along the wall, it's an incredibly powerful, very, very visual. So the heart, I felt, worked as a symbol in a number of different ways. It represented one individual. It represented the pain, the physical pain of loss and the memory of that person.
Yeah.
It also evoked this idea almost of a drop of blood. So there's something about the mass of the red that in itself is slightly confronting.
Nice.
You cannot escape the scale of it. So for me, it acted as a memorial, but it acted as a way of an individual being able to mark their loss. And so that was another really powerful image for me.
Yeah, it reminds me, as you've described that, there's a memorial in Christchurch in New Zealand, which I think about a decade ago experienced a terrible earthquake, and about 290 lives were lost. Their cathedral toppled. There were many buildings that were destroyed. The whole entire sort of center of the city was destroyed. And there's a memorial there. It's in just it sort of looks like a car park, but it's sort of 290 white chairs that are empty, and it's sort of all different chairs that have been set up in this car park, this former car park. It's very rubbly, and all the chairs are sort of kind of different. There's baby chairs, and there's lounge. It is just exactly what you say, the evoking that, what's missing, of making it, the numbers seem exactly real. And I've seen another one quite similar outside the Tower of London, I think, to mark the centenary of the end of World War I, where they put poppies, sort of, I think they were, I don't think they were real ones, but beaded ones or something, all around the Tower of London. It was a sea of these poppies, and exactly the color and the physicality of them, and seeing it everywhere, it just, brings it to life, doesn't it? So it's incredibly powerful. So you've talked about some, ways in which those sorts of images can evoke really strong understandings and feelings that you might not have from things written on a page. What are the ideas, concepts, methods, or insights from your work and the work in your field do you think will help us to understand how we're going to remember what we've been through over these last 2 years?
If I actually have quite a long list, so I'm going to read from it, but my memory metaphors are, I'll often build up something in layers. And I think in the pandemic in particular, there was that sense of it started to layer one thing on top of another and escalated. And many people, myself included, found it very overwhelming. There is the sense of things blurring, one day often blurs into another, but I use these kind of ideas of something being in focus and then something else not being in focus. A sense of fading out. I use shadows, things being cast from something else. And that sometimes can be an absence of someone or something, and also repetition and change. So I'm very interested in how you can take an image and evolve it and keep revisiting and then changing it as an artist or designer over a period of time, because I think that is what also happens to our own memories. And Daniel, in the interview with Andrew, spoke to that so eloquently.
Daniel Schachter, exactly.
Yes, so we've had this shift. Our lives have become much more mediated. The use of mobile phones, that everyone has a camera in their hand all of the time. But also this sense of the distraction that leads to, and the sense of multitasking and perhaps not paying attention to the things that we might properly and genuinely pay attention to. And I am very aware of those mediated shifts, because I need to firewall my own life. If I'm going to get time to be in the studio and be uninterrupted and uncluttered in my thinking, I need to choose and be very conscious about what I choose to bring into my life and what I actually hold back and say no. So I'm very interested in some of the recent memory work that is looking at the influence of the media aspect of our title, Memory, Mind and Media.
Yes. And
how the media aspects influence our mind's ability to think, feel, react well to things. And also, I'm not sure about you and your own educational experience, but I've really noticed an increase in the incidences of students suffering from anxiety and depression. It's been particularly prevalent over the last 2 years of the pandemic. And I'm very mindful, and I say to them, look, priority number one is look after yourself and your own mental health. And so we actually sometimes use drawings in our classes to visualize and get things out of our heads.
Yeah.
And I was getting my students sometimes to draw spirals and to explain how you need to recognize when, you know, you're in a spiral going down. And one of my students did a beautiful project, and she chose as her journey, they had to draw a journey, her journey through anxiety during the pandemic. And she visualized all of the things that helped. Yeah. And then she had another section of the things that she knew that made it worse. By drawing pictures of these objects and subjects and themes, she made it real for herself. So she got it out of her head. It stopped that kind of, you know, thinking. So I'm very interested. I think your title is brilliant. So I'm really interested in those overlaps between all three things.
Yeah, no. And so I mean, the role of media has been one that's been discussed a lot, hasn't it, over the last 2 years? And I've been following discussions around the role that media has played in people's beliefs or opinions or even behaviors around, you know, sort of contested discussions around approaches and lockdowns and mandates and vaccinations. And I guess, you know, that's focusing, some of that discussion focuses on written things and the information. So what role do you think media, especially around the sharing of certain images or not sharing of images, or of focusing on certain things and not others? You talked about sort of things in focus and things blurring. What role do you think the media has been playing in the pandemic, and how people will get through it okay?
So I have a kind of slightly pessimistic response to that, and then I'm going to finish with an optimistic response. So I found within about a week of the start of the official declaration of the pandemic that I actually started to suffer from anxiety myself. And it was it was generating doom scrolling. And within very short order, our sons are grown up in their 20s, have moved away from home, but within a couple of weeks, both our sons returned. Our younger son studies at the University of Edinburgh and flew back because the university had closed to students. So I said to them at breakfast one morning, I don't know about you, but I'm actually finding this completely overwhelming. I slept really badly last night. There's nothing I can do about any of this. There's tragedy upon tragedy out there in the world. It's only going to get worse for quite a considerable period of time. And I'm going to make a choice not to interact. Yeah. So I might maybe once a week review the Guardian. I really like the Guardian because it has a beautiful visual and verbal balance. They really promote artwork, illustrations, images, as well as written text. And within a couple of days, both my sons had followed my lead and said, you're not kidding, I feel really overwhelmed right now. And you know, Ross had to study, Scott was working. So we all went to our stations, did what we had to do, but we actually chose not to come into this sense of pessimism of something that we really ultimately couldn't do much about. Yeah. More optimistically, and this comes to Andrew's conversation with Daniel in one of your other wonderful interviews, I received a gift in the middle of the longest lockdown in Sydney. And previous to the lockdown, previous to the pandemic, we'd had a wonderful holiday in Tasmania with some friends. And our friend Jill Davies had said at the time, oh, let's all share photos from the trip. And Daniel commented that often now we take photos, but they don't go anywhere and they don't anchor in memories because they're no longer real. We don't now print them out. And we suddenly received a parcel. And in the parcel, and this also comes back to the power of visual images. Yes. Was a book that Jill had decided to make and have printed. And you know, you can do these things in multiple different ways. Yes, exactly. Of a trip that was very much about being away with friends in nature. And the note said, you know, here's to the other side. Here's to coming out the other part when we can really go and be together and share these sorts of experiences again. And it was one of those classic moments of we shared a Zoom dinner. Who knew that was going to become a thing? And she said, when you get this parcel, don't open it. We'll all open it together. And so it also became a memory of a new experience. It was this positive little light of optimism in the midst of an otherwise dark space. So I feel that sometimes making images real and bringing our memories of more positive things consciously to the fronts of our minds can be a very effective tool and antidote to those darker senses of pessimism. So I very much stayed away from media. No disrespect to journalists who do an incredible job in difficult times. But from my own mental health point of view, I made that choice. And I do think that we have a conscious choice and a responsibility to ourselves to live well and to think about these things and what we choose to engage with and what we don't.
No, I think that's a beautiful answer, because it's just one of the fundamental themes, I think, of the journal, which is the balance between remembering and forgetting. That psychological health and probably collective health is somewhere at the intersection of remembering important things and forgetting some things as well. And I can't remember if I've told you this story or I've shared it on another video, but one of the most sort of compelling stories I've heard of this kind is the story of a man named Andrew Nicky Barr, who was a World War II fighter pilot from Australia, and he served in the Air Force over in North Africa, and he was married, I think, a couple of weeks before the war commenced. In the early 1940s, and he goes off to war and he leaves his wife Dorothy here at home, and he's flying all these missions, and he was shot down like 5 times or something, sustained some really significant injuries. He was in prisoner of war camps 2 or 3 times. He escaped from them. He came home, and it wasn't until 50 years later that he was ever interviewed publicly because he was given sort of the highest medal or award that the sort of an Australian service person can receive. But he never talked about it publicly. And when he finally did on a program called Australian Story, he said, I never wanted to think about those. It would never have served me well to go back and think about the things that I wasn't very proud of, that I didn't want to remember. And when we started to think about it, he and his wife, all the memories got on top of us and was very distressing. And so, people and groups and whole generations sometimes who don't actually want to think and talk about certain kinds of things, and have found ways in which they move forward by remembering certain things and forgetting other things. And what that balance is, and how we as people who've come after help to commemorate those things, but are respectful of that balance between what they want to remember and don't, I think is a really important topic for the journal, because there's lots of, areas and countries and conflicts in which I think this has been really relevant. And so you've described that really, really beautiful.
I completely agree. I think that's a really powerful story. I mean, the other side of that perhaps is to also say that I fully recognize that bearing witness through war, through times of very difficult planetary challenges such as climate change. I've done a lot of work in the climate change space, and I do try to get that balance of getting a more positive reflection on what is really a critically challenging time for Earth. So I think that bearing witness, an artist and designer's role in that, because people remember images much more readily than they remember text.
Exactly.
But if you can actually get people to draw, then they remember even more. So there's been multiple studies done which prove that one of the most effective things that you can do for your brain's ability to retain information is to physically draw the item itself, because it anchors it into your memory in a much clearer and more effective long-term way. So I'm very interested in that. I've run workshops at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney during the big Anxiety Festival, which was part of Mental Health Month in New South Wales. And I actually advertised the workshops for people suffering from anxiety and depression. And we looked at mindful meditations and drawings. And we just literally had a media-free day. There were no PowerPoints involved. And we drew together, and it was a really powerful experience. I evaluated the workshops, and then I ran a second one as well. So I've written up, I see myself as a scholar and as an artist and designer. I wrote up that particular work in the Drawing Research Theory and Practice journal. And this idea of art as an antidote to anxiety really interests me. and the things that we ruminate on when we become anxious or stressed, and the role that memories, particularly memories that keep on coming, whether we want them to or not, and how we can mediate that, how we can improve and live our lives more productively, and the role that drawings in particular have, as part of that.
Yeah, and you've really raised the sort of the moral dimension of remembering as well, don't you? Of, when we feel that we have a responsibility to bear witness, to remember, and sort of then the difference between, those who have suffered in certain and what they want to remember or forget, and those of us who are there to support or scaffold or, ensure that things don't happen again. One of the, here in Australia, of course, we will come up again and we'll commemorate Anzac Day, where it's always lest we forget. So there's something really interesting and moral about that, isn't it? That we have to think. So from this time, the last 2 years, I've asked everyone that I've interviewed the same question around COVID. What do you think you'll remember most from this time?
There's one particular moment, which was a Sunday morning, and I read a headline, which was that 4 planes had been turned back midair from London to Spain when Spain closed its border. And I very, very quickly booked a flight for our younger son. And within 48 hours, he was on his way home from the University of Edinburgh. And that really, there was this sense of, there's something coming and it's big. So if I'm being really honest, that's a very powerful memory. The second thing is, conversely, and I'm almost reluctant to say this because I fully recognize the extraordinary global loss that people have endured, and that it was a very, very difficult time, and it is still a very, very difficult time for many different countries and many different individuals. But it was strange for us because both our sons came to live back at home again when we weren't expecting that to happen. And we really chose to embrace and make the most of that time. Our world shrunk.
Yes.
Became very small. We weren't doing the traveling that we might normally do. But I still have this memory of sitting outside and reading a book. And my younger son was lying beside me reading his book. And I smiled at him and I said, "It's nice to have you home."
Yeah.
The reason for him being home, not so nice, but it comes back to that. Often there is this duality. There are often two ways to frame something. So I fully recognize that was not everyone's experience. But for me personally, I will remember the books that were read, the conversations that were had around the dinner table, and that shared time.
Yeah, and those rememberings will be good for all of you, won't they? Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Emma. It's been such a delight to talk to you. If everyone would like to read more about, and more importantly, see Emma's beautiful images and art, you can follow us on Twitter at MMM where our profile features Emma's images, or visit us on Cambridge University Press Memory, Mind and Media. I really hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. We'll see you again soon.